Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting lecture here in American Studies 201, and welcome to what is sadly, tragically, apocalyptically, not just the last lecture here in our final time period of American culture in an age of demographic change, but our final lecture in the course. In our final weeks together, both in lecture and in readings, we're talking about the ways in which America's demography has changed since 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, and how that has created debates about American community, American identity, that stubborn question in American history of who is an American. Now, in recent lectures, we've talked about how that develops out of changes in immigration patterns. In recent weeks, you've been reading Dave Edgar's book, which is about the experience of a Syrian immigrant to America. Here in this final lecture, we're going to continue this fourth and final time period and theme by examining three cardinal central developments in the first decade of the 21st century that demonstrate the ongoing debates about American identity in an age of greater diversity. So this is our final lecture in this final time period. This is our final lecture in the class. It will round out all that you need to know for a final project coming soon. And at the end of this lecture, we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about the broader themes in the entirety of the class. So let's dive into here our final lecture in the course. As I mentioned, in this final lecture, we're going to be examining three cardinal central developments in the first decade of the 21st century that really bring to light this issue of American identity, this question of who is one of us, who is an American, in relationship to the demographic change we've been talking a great deal about. And the first of those developments in the first decade of the 21st century, as here in our final lecture, we bring the class into the contemporary period, concerns the aftermath of September 11th, the War on Terror, and the Patriot Act, and how it raised issues regarding notions of rights, privileges associated with American citizenship, American identity, with being an American. Now, the Patriot Act is not singular in terms of the way in which it indicates how questions of rights and civil liberties come into question in a time of war. In World War I, we passed legislation that effectively banned free speech with the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. In World War II, people of Japanese descent were rounded up and held in concentration camps, most of which were located here in the state of California. During the Cold War, the great collision of wills between the United States and the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II, you had legislation passed here in the United States that made thought a crime. In some states in the late 40s and early 50s, if you claimed to be a communist, if you said, I believe in this way of thinking, this body of ideas, that alone could be considered a criminal offense, and you could be arrested and incarcerated simply for believing in a way of thinking. So the Patriot Act is not singular. It is not the only example of this question of civil liberties in wartime. In fact, that is a theme in the totality of American history, going back even to the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. But it is a contemporary example of this ongoing theme. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, soon after, in the weeks after that event, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which was a mammoth bill that later many who criticized the bill admitted that they had not read it. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, there was widespread belief that those attacks were the first of many, that the attacks on the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and the aborted attack on Washington, D.C. that led to that plane crash in Pennsylvania, many assumed that was the first of many attacks to come. And as a result, Congress wanted to do something to take measures that would potentially protect America from future acts. Senators and Congresspeople did not want to be seen as leaving America vulnerable. And that's why many of them passed this bill, the Patriot Act, even if they had not read it. And what's interesting is that many who came out later as critics of the bill, who said it's too far-reaching, too excessive in the way in which it compromises basic civil liberties, empowers the federal government to do things the federal government should not be allowed to do, many who made those criticisms, who remain fierce critics of the Patriot Act, actually voted for it because they had not read what was in this bill. What was in the bill? Well, the Patriot Act granted the federal government, law enforcement agencies, wide latitude to wiretap, to intercept messages, cell phone calls, emails, and also obtain records that had been previously denied to these law enforcement agencies or required a warrant. And if they obtained these records, this information, if they had a wiretap or in some way were able to gain access to personal information, they could do so without notifying the person who was being monitored in this way. The library books, you check out the library. Someone could come from the FBI and audit that without giving you a knowledge of that, without notifying you. These were unprecedented. These were, again, previously foreclosed, denied to these law enforcement agencies. Previously, they required things like a warrant in order to indeed establish a wiretap. But the argument for the Patriot Act was, well, we don't have time for those niceties. We don't have time for those procedures. If terrorists are plotting an attack, we need to know about it. If there are people within the United States who we suspect of being terrorists or sympathizers, collaborators with terrorists, we need to know. So again, all of this developed in the aftermath of September 11th, when there was widespread fear and hysteria and conviction that another attack was imminent. And the idea was security must come first. That in the tension that often exists, again, in American history regarding civil liberties in wartime, the tension between concerns regarding security and concerns regarding individual rights, liberty, protection from an intrusive federal government, that security must be ultimately paramount. Much of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is designed to protect you from a potentially intrusive federal government. Things like habeas corpus rights, right to a jury trial, right to access of representation, protection from unlawful searches and seizures. All that, again, is based on the idea the federal government can't do this. Well, the Patriot Act was an effort to loosen that and allow the federal government to have greater ability to, again, obtain records that previously required a warrant or some sort of check on what could potentially be an intrusive federal government. Also, in the aftermath of September 11th, thousands of people within the borders of the United States were rounded up. Some of them were American citizens, others were immigrants from Southwest Asia, or what's commonly referred to as the Middle East. People like Abdul Rahman Zaytoun, who you're reading about in the Eggers book. So this is a good example of why the Patriot Act, the war on terror that followed the attacks of September 11, 2001, is really crucial as one of these events to think about in relation to what we've been now talking about, reading about for some time, the way in which America's demography changes after 1965. In a recent lecture, we talked about the Hart-Celler Act. We talked about the increased number of immigrants in total after 1965, and in particular how immigrants tend to come from places like Asia, Africa, the Middle East. And so since 1965, we've seen an increase of immigration from that part of the world, people like Abdul Rahman Zaytoun. Well, those are the people who were targeted by these sweeps done by law enforcement, rounding up people who were American citizens. Either they naturalized as citizens or they were born here and therefore had protection as citizens, rounded them up and often denied them access to a lawyer, access to, again, habeas corpus rights that are enunciated in the Constitution. So this is really demonstrative, again, of these debates about who is an American. Does it mean you're a citizen? Well, many of these people were citizens. If you are a citizen, or if you are within the borders of this nation, don't you have certain protections associated with an American identity? This is foundational. This is rooted, again, in our sense of us. We as Americans, we have these basic liberties, the Bill of Rights. It comes right out of our origins in the American Revolution and the Constitution. The Supreme Court has ruled consistently throughout our history that the Bill of Rights does not only apply to American citizens, it applies to everyone who is in the borders of the United States. If you are within the borders of the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the federal government, then you are also eligible for the protections that come with the Constitution. And yet, after September 11th, thousands of American citizens, people within this nation, were rounded up in this fashion, held for months without charges because there weren't any charges. They weren't guilty of a crime. They were simply guilty of being a Muslim in America. They were simply guilty of being somehow tied to the Middle East. So this is what happened in this country in the months after September 11th. It demonstrates how people who are American citizens, many of whom had naturalized or were born here, people like Abdul Rahman Zaytoun, could be treated differently based on their background, their religion, and denied rights. And so American identity, how we think of ourselves as Americans, is often associated with certain rights and freedoms. We are the nation that, again, is rooted in things like the Bill of Rights. This is often central to an American vision of self, of an American identity. And yet, Americans in this country were denied that, again, based on their status as immigrants from the Middle East, based on their religion. This is what was possible in America, not just after September 11th, but in an America where there was now a sizable number of people of Middle Eastern descent because of the changes in demography, changes in immigration patterns that we've been talking about now for some time in our final weeks together. Also, the aftermath of September 11th, the context of the adoption of the Patriot Act, really demonstrated again a larger debate about American identity and our identity in relation to things like certain rights, privileges, immunities that are often associated with being an American. In early 2002, right after the attacks and the months after the attack, the Justice Department of the Bush administration declared that American citizens could be declared by the government enemy combatants if they were seen to associate with terrorist groups. We've had some examples of American citizens who have left the United States, gone to the Middle East, and joined many of the well-known terrorist groups like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. In fact, there's a famous figure from Orange County, Adam Godin, who famously went to the Middle East, renounced his citizenship, and associated with terrorist groups in the Middle East. And what the enemy combatant declaration allowed for was the federal government can declare American citizens thus enemy combatants based on their associations with terrorist groups, and as a result deny them rights and protections associated with their citizenship and even kill them on the battlefield. And many American citizens who have, like Adam Godin, associated with these terrorist groups, been declared enemy combatants, have been killed by the federal government. Now, there'll be few people who will feel sympathetic to American citizens who join terrorist groups who want to engage in terrorist activities against the United States, but the legal and philosophical question looms here, that your government can declare that you don't have rights, even if you are an American citizen. Your government now, for the first time, this had never occurred before, this is again a new development in the aftermath of September 11th, your government now can strip American citizens of their rights and even kill American citizens without legal recourse. So again, in real terms and practical terms, the people who are declared enemy combatants aren't people that we're going to shed a tear over because they, again, willfully join these terrorist groups. But what this establishes now as a legal philosophical precedent is that it is now possible for the federal government to strip American citizens of their rights, declare them enemy combatants, and even kill them. That was one of the ways in which notions of rights, citizenship have changed since September 11th. The spokesperson for the Bush administration in Bush's first term, we're talking about George W. Bush, who was president during the attacks of September 11, 2001, his press secretary, his spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, in response to controversies surrounding the American comedian Bill Maher, said Americans, quote, should watch what they say. Bill Maher, who in late 2001, early 2002, had a TV show on ABC called Politically Correct, said some things that many found offensive in regards to the attacks of September 11th. And there was a big campaign against ABC to remove Bill Maher from the air. And eventually that campaign succeeded. So there you go. So much for cancel culture as something new, or cancel culture that only, again, affects certain people of certain political points of view. Actually, Bill Maher really was canceled because in the controversy that surrounded his statements and the campaign launched by ABC eventually removed him. Again, he had a TV show called Politically Incorrect. So you might expect him to say things that were controversial. But what he said was evidently too controversial for some Americans, and he ultimately was removed from the air, and then eventually he goes off to HBO, where he still is today on his new program, Real Time. But in the wake of that controversy, you now had a representative of the U.S. government, the administration of George W. Bush, stating that, well, Americans should watch what they say. What this did was it sort of created a cloud, a cloak that seemed to threaten free speech in America. Bill Maher was removed from the air, and eventually he got his own TV program on HBO, and he can say whatever he wants. But to have the federal government, a spokesperson, the press secretary for the Bush administration say this, again, it was seen by many as, again, a cloud, a cloak of fear that descended over Americans, that they now had to watch what they say, and the federal government was taking that stand that seemed to imperil, endanger free expression, free speech, things that are rooted in American, again, law and identity associated with the First Amendment. The chief law enforcement officer in the Bush administration, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, said that criticism of the Bush administration's policies, quote, aids the country's enemies. If you are critical of this administration, if you are critical of the Bush administration, well, you're helping the terrorist. That was the clear assertion of, again, not just some random guy on Twitter here. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer, the guy who has a lot of power to, again, silence Americans, incarcerate Americans during this time where they were rounding up thousands of people. So Ashcroft clearly asserted that if you're not supportive of the Bush administration with its efforts to do things like invade Iraq and launch the Iraqi war, invade a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, the Bush administration received a great deal of criticism in regards to the Patriot Act, in regards in particular to its effort to ramp up a war against Iraq. If you were critical of the Bush administration, the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, John Ashcroft, said, well, you're helping the enemies. Bush was famous for saying, President Bush, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so all of this, again, is coming from the federal government. And it seemed to really indicate that basic American freedoms and liberties were compromised here. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. We're talking about the ways in which Americans come to assume certain ideals associated with American citizenship, American identity. This, again, is a question of what does it mean to be an American. We would often assume that being an American meant the right to say what you want without fear of reprisal from the government. The First Amendment protects free speech from the government coming in and silencing you. And here the government, in the remarks made by Fleischer and Ashcroft, seemed to really threaten that basic American value. Then in Bush's second term, he was reelected in 2004, it was revealed that his National Security Administration was wiretapping Americans without a warrant, which seemed to be an open violation of law and basic protections established under the Constitution, under the Bill of Rights, that we associate with American citizenship. What happened was the federal government would wiretap certain phone conversations and then after that get a warrant, when previously you first had to get a warrant before you could pursue such a wiretap. And this seemed to be a bold threat to basic civil liberties and constitutional protections. One of the reasons why you're required to go to a court to get a warrant is that there needs to be a check against the federal government using its power to listen in on people's private conversations. This seemed to violate constitutional protections against unlawful searches and seizures. So this was a huge scandal in the first decade of the 21st century in Bush's second term, and it seemed to indicate that, again, something had changed, that American citizens were now subject to certain intrusions by the federal government that they had long imagined would always be protected. These constitutional protections. Now, again, this is not anomalous throughout our history, going back to things like the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798, going back to the Civil War when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and rounded up hundreds of his political enemies, going back to things like the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. This had happened previously, but this seemed to be, for this generation of Americans, another beat in that rhythm, one that was affecting them directly, again, in the aftermath of September 11th, where basic liberties that we associate with American citizenship, American identities, in many ways what we often see as the core of being an American. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It's in our First Amendment. It comes out of the revolutionary heritage. It's right there in the Constitution. After September 11th, those basic rights and liberties we associate with American origins, American identity, American citizenship, to be a member of the American community and fall under that umbrella, the first three words of the Constitution, we the people, those liberties now seem to be endangered. But public opinion polls revealed that a majority of Americans did not see this as threatening. In fact, supported a lot of these programs. One, because of, again, the fear and hysteria that followed September 11, 2001, where most Americans were convinced there'll be more attacks. But interestingly, again, to tack back to how this fits with these questions of demographic change and immigration. Another reason why a majority of Americans in public opinion polls did not object to these bald and open threats on basic liberties was there was this belief that the people being targeted here are immigrants from the Middle East or Muslim Americans. And so the idea here was, well, they're not going to wiretap me, the, white Midwestern Protestant American citizen. They're going to be wiretapping those people, right? This idea that the scrutiny and the compromise of civil liberties would only fall on people who weren't necessarily imagined to be part of the American community because of race or religion. So we have been talking now for some time about the new immigrants, how after 1965 immigrants tend to come from places like Southeast Asia, like Southwest Asia, areas that have a large Muslim population. We have talked about how America's religious and racial demography has changed, and that inflected and influenced the way in which Americans responded to the threats to American liberties, American freedoms that came after September 11th. Americans were willing to put up with this if they believed others were being targeted, racial minorities, religious minorities. They didn't see it as a threat to their own freedom. If instead, the people who are being regulated, the people who are being subject to these policies are, again, Muslims or immigrants. And this is interesting to think about in regards to now where we are much later in terms of restrictions associated with COVID. And this objection to wearing a mask or being subject to certain forms of regulation, how people resist that if they feel as if they don't deserve to be treated in that way, to be restricted. They may be willing to accept restrictions that fall upon others, but when it violates their sense of rights and freedom associated with their identity as Americans, then you get all of this resistance. So quite often in American history, if it is people like Japanese Americans in World War II or political dissidents in the Cold War who are being targeted, Americans often accept these bald affronts at personal liberty. But when those restrictions fall on Americans who aren't assuming that they are the minority and see themselves instead as the real Americans or the majority, then you get these forms of resistance. So we begin this lecture by thinking about how basic elements of American identity, basic freedoms, things we associate with American identity, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, were severely compromised after September 11th with things like the Patriot Act and the blows against civil liberty and freedom we've enunciated on this slide. And then we put that in dialogue with the changing demography and the way in which many Americans were willing to accept this open violation of civil liberties if it fell upon, again, immigrants or religious minorities. All right, in this lecture, we're examining 3 events of the first decade of the 21st century that really demonstrate how we live in an age of debate regarding American identity and the American community. The first of those events, Patriot Act, and the aftermath of September 11th. The second of the events I want to talk about in this lecture that allow us to think about the fractures and divisions, the forces of inclusion and exclusion that are alive at this moment in the 21st century regarding American community and identity, is Hurricane Katrina. Now, there was a storm, Hurricane Katrina, but the disaster that Hurricane Katrina represents and its power, its revelatory power for us to think about in terms of what it says about what it means to be an American in the 21st century, actually came in the aftermath of the storm. Rather than think of this as a natural disaster, we should instead think about the destruction of a great American city as a human-created or man-made disaster, because what destroyed New Orleans and set in motion this nationwide, worldwide debate about American identity and American community in the aftermath of this disaster was the destruction of levees that were not properly maintained by the federal government that allowed for the flooding of New Orleans and the destruction of a great American city. That's why we should understand this event as a man-made disaster. There was the hurricane, and then there was the aftermath of the hurricane. The city weathered the storm pretty well. In fact, when Hurricane Katrina blew through New Orleans, there was, for a very brief moment, a sigh of relief after the storm passed, because there's a big buildup to this hurricane. People were rightfully concerned and fearful. And then when the storm blew through and there wasn't as much damage as some anticipated, many said, well, we've dodged a bullet. And then the levees broke. And when the levees broke, the true disaster began. The levees were the province of the federal government and were to be properly maintained by the federal government, and yet they were not maintained. The levees were allowed to go without proper maintenance. They atrophied, and they couldn't deal with the volume of water that came with the storm. The levees broke and inundated the city. Now, many had fled the city in the days and weeks prior to the storm, but many could not because they didn't have a car. They didn't have the financial means to live on the road, on the fly, for an indefinite period of time. If you're going to leave your home, you need a credit card. You need a means of supporting yourself. And many people didn't have those resources. So the people who were left behind in New Orleans were mostly poor. Many of them were African Americans. And so they were the true victims of the destruction of a great American city that, again, could have been prevented. It was the levees and the breaching of the levees that destroyed the city, not the hurricane. And then, on top of that, you had this very pathetic and inept response. One of the reasons why I think Hurricane Katrina is one of these signal moments for us to mine and draw upon to understand where we are today in America in the 21st century is that it demonstrated the inability of the federal government to protect its citizens. One, by not maintaining the levees that were there to protect the city. But once the levees broke and the city was flooded, the federal government's response was pathetic. The city had urged people to head to the Superdome, the football stadium, or to the convention center. And when people amassed at the convention center, there was no one there to provide basic necessities, food, water, medical treatment, baby formula. And thousands of people, upon the direction of the local government, headed to the New Orleans Convention Center, and the federal government was unaware that there were people there in need. In fact, it was in a press conference where reporters were saying to the representatives of FEMA and other federal agencies, there are people at the convention center who need help. And it was only then that the federal government was made aware. The federal government was completely oblivious. It had to be told that there are people in dire need by the media. Bodies floated for days. The death toll mounted. People went without care in hospitals as hospitals were overwhelmed. And this is part of the lesson of the Hurricane Katrina incident. It seemed to demonstrate that in the wealthiest country in human history, we couldn't do the basics to protect our citizens. It seemed to indicate that the federal government was inept at these basic things like emergency response. It seemed to many to augur for the end of American dominance and power, American greatness, that this could happen in the wealthiest country on earth, that this could happen. And when such a crisis occurs, our government could be so pathetic and inept. And at the time, it seemed like an indictment of the failure of the federal government. It was waging a war in Iraq, but it was unable to protect its own citizens here at home from a flood and destruction of a great American city. And now we reflect on it 15 years later, and it seems like an indication, a way of indicating where we are now in our contemporary crisis regarding COVID, and the strong belief among many people that the federal government has once again dropped the ball. The federal government hasn't taken action that we have seen other governments around the world take to do the basics to protect the American community from a great crisis and disaster. So Hurricane Katrina has been a little bit in the limelight this year because it's the 15th anniversary. There's been some great podcasts, The Flood, a great documentary series done by Spike Lee for HBO that I encourage you to check out. But it's basically under the radar. But I think when we reflect on this event of 2005, we can see a lot that, again, augurs for, indicates in a very ominous way, later crises like those of 2020. When aid finally arrived, the death toll had mounted to over 1,500. One of the greatest cities in the world was destroyed right in front of our eyes. New Orleans has this remarkable history as once a city claimed by the Spanish, the French, and the colonial period. Certainly a great American city, the home of that great American idiom of music, jazz, and yet destroyed. There are parts of New Orleans that haven't been rebuilt even now, 15 years later, where we've just abandoned a part of the city. And that's another wrinkle in Hurricane Katrina, another way in which we could put it in dialogue with our contemporary crisis. For this to happen, it seemed like Americans couldn't do great things anymore. We couldn't achieve what we had in earlier periods when we built Hoover Dam, when we won World War II, when we put a man on the moon. Here, in the wealthiest country in human history, we couldn't protect our own citizens, and we allowed one of the great American cities to be destroyed in front of our eyes, and then, now, many years later, we've yet to rebuild. After Hurricane Katrina, there were a lot of hopeful messages in America that we could actually seize this crisis and from it build the first great American city of the 21st century. New Orleans could be rebuilt, reclaimed. We could emphasize things like green technology, new technologies, and really seize this moment that, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, where we could claim a disaster and then make a statement of a reclaimed American greatness. But that didn't happen. As I've said, 15 years after this event, there are parts of New Orleans that have never been rebuilt. People fled the city and never came back. We did not turn New Orleans in the aftermath of the flood into the great American project of the 21st century. And that seemed to indicate that perhaps America has lost its great standing, that we can't do great things anymore. And then put that insight that was so alive in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in dialogue with a lot of the pessimism that surrounds us now here in 2020. Hurricane Katrina was advertised to the world through cable television. In 2005, cable news now was the main way in which Americans came to see their nation. This was at a period where the internet certainly was available, but it wasn't yet the force it is today. The COVID crisis and other crises of 2020 have been mostly adjudicated, mediated through the internet. But in 2005, the major media force for the reporting on Hurricane Katrina, the flooding of the city, came through cable news. And so 24 hours a day, you could watch this drama play out, the misery. You could become frustrated by the inept and pathetic and callous response of the federal government. And you could be, once again, shaken by the fact that this was happening in America, in the wealthiest nation in human history. Soon after Hurricane Katrina, I personally traveled to Manila to begin my dissertation research. And wherever I went in the Philippines, people would ask me about this event. And they'd say, how could that happen in America? How could the greatest, most powerful nation on earth be unable to respond to this crisis? It was a great shock to people around the world, people in underdeveloped parts of the world, in places like the Philippines, Africa, Asia, what was previously derisively sometimes called the third world. We often associate these sort of disasters and inept responses by governments in those parts of the world, but now it was happening in the United States, and people were shocked by it, that this could happen. And it seemed to indicate that, again, America was in a stage of decline, that the great American nation was failing its own people, and all this, again, could be seen on television screens around the nation and around the world. Another element of Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath that I think augurs in many ways indicates where we are today in 2020 concerned the issue of race. As I mentioned, many of the people who were unable to flee the city were poor. Many of them were African American. And when they disproportionately became the victims of this failure of government to protect its citizens and provide relief, it sparked a debate in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans regarding race and the people left behind, the people who were not prospering in America in the early 21st century, the people who were still stung by patterns of poverty and the legacies of segregation and disenfranchisement in the period before the Civil Rights Revolution of the 60s and 70s. In the 1960s and 1970s, we changed laws that allowed racial minorities to vote, to attend universities, to work in professions they had been previously denied. And many Americans sought to see that as the end of questions regarding race and civil rights. But with Hurricane Katrina, we saw how, though those laws changed in the 60s and 70s, they didn't ameliorate poverty, and they didn't reverse the legacies of decades, centuries of denying people education, employment, and opportunity. So Hurricane Katrina was also a moment to think about race, the legacies of discrimination, Jim Crow, denying people education, employment, opportunities to build wealth, who remain left behind in America of the 21st century. One of the notorious incidents associated with the flooding of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina was a televised telethon that took place where celebrities appeared and many of them performed in an effort to encourage Americans to donate money to relief programs advanced by groups like the Red Cross. And there's a very famous incident, perhaps some of you have seen it, take 2 seconds to pull it up on YouTube, where Kanye West appeared on the telethon and said right there to the camera and to millions of Americans watching this, George W. Bush, then president, doesn't care about black people. And this was an ad-lib line that shook and in many ways stymied Mike Myers, who was on screen with Kanye at the time. And if you've seen this notorious incident on YouTube, you could see, Mike Myers visibly shook by this because he wasn't prepared for Kanye to make such a political statement. But Kanye's statement was indicative of the way in which many people felt that Hurricane Katrina, the flooding of New Orleans, the way in which the misery and pain disproportionately fell upon people who had long been subject to racism and discrimination was another way of, again, thinking about fractures, fissures in regards to the American community. That African Americans, poor African Americans in New Orleans, who were on rooftops waving to helicopters seeking aid and support, African Americans who died in the city when they were abandoned, that their experience in America represents how they remain excluded from prosperity, opportunity, and the American dream. So if this was an event by which we could think about what does it mean to be an American, it was clear in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, in terms of who was left behind, who was victimized, the pathetic and inept response of the federal government, that African Americans, poor African Americans in New Orleans, continued to be again denied recognition and equality as members of the American community. There was certainly a racialized element to Hurricane Katrina, and again, that also indicates how we can put it in dialogue with America today in the ongoing debates regarding race, in the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, and that's another way in which we could think of Hurricane Katrina not as a singular isolated event, but one that is very much tied to continuing events that we're all living through here in 2020. Another reason why this event is so important is that it really marked the end of George Bush as a true figure of power and clout in American politics. George Bush had been reelected in 2004, and then soon after you have this event, the storm, Hurricane Katrina, and the flooding of New Orleans. Now, when Bush was reelected, he hoped to accomplish a lot in his second term, and he proposed efforts to do things like privatize Social Security, also immigration reform, which we'll get to in our next couple of slides, and he failed to achieve any of that. And then there was a major financial crisis, and Barack Obama would win the White House in 2008 and shift political power to the Democratic Party for some time. So the second term for George W. Bush was a complete disaster. But before the financial crisis, there was this moment, Hurricane Katrina, the flooding of New Orleans, and the way in which his government, the federal government, was so pathetic in its response. There's a very famous photograph, well circulated at the time, of Bush flying over New Orleans in Air Force One and looking down upon the city. And when that photograph was broadcast around the nation, people saw it as King George looking on from up high on the people down below. He didn't land the plane. He didn't get down and survey the damage. He was seen as someone literally flying above the misery in a detached way. It seemed to reinforce the idea the federal government was callous and indifferent. It's what led to Kanye saying things like George W. Bush doesn't care about black people. And so what this did was it really sunk Bush's second term. It really made him politically impotent because he was seen as the leader of a nation during this great crisis that failed its people. He responded, though, by trying to reclaim his image and really take up this question of race. And he said that this event does demonstrate a long history of racial discrimination, that this population of people in New Orleans is a microcosm of continuing failures in our nation to integrate racial minorities into American opportunity and prosperity. And another event, another thread, another theme that for a moment was very vibrant in America after Hurricane Katrina was this concern about those left behind. And there were calls for not just rebuilding New Orleans, making it the great American project of the 21st century, but realizing true reform that would empower racial minorities and grant them greater opportunities to vault out of poverty. And all that fizzled as well. And it leads, again, in a very direct way to the ongoing debates we're still having about race in America and those left behind now in the age of more contemporary crises like police brutality and the way in which COVID is disproportionately hurting people of color. So Hurricane Katrina may be in our distant memory, but it really is a rich and very revealing moment 15 years ago that presages so many of the debates we're having in America today in 2020 about race, about those left behind, about the failure of the federal government to protect its citizens in a time of crisis, the seeming indifference of American government to the suffering of its people, the inability of America to do great things, the inability of America in the 21st century to continue to be this great wealthy nation when it seems like we are indeed in decline. The only action that was taken after Hurricane Katrina was to undermine anti-poverty efforts. If Hurricane Katrina was seen as a moment for rethinking those left behind, it didn't lead to such efforts. It didn't lead to a massive effort to either rebuild New Orleans or a massive anti-poverty movement like earlier crises had. In the early 60s, there was a lot of attention to those left behind by muckraking journalists of that age, like Michael Harrington, who published a book called The Other America that shocked America regarding people who were impoverished and left behind. That led to things like Medicaid and Medicare and the war on poverty, Head Start in the 1960s. Hurricane Katrina was imagined to be a moment where we thought again about those left behind and the legacies of discrimination and racism. But in the end, Congress passed spending bills that cut aid for people impoverished. And there hasn't been a great effort to rebuild New Orleans. And as a result, again, there's a lot of lessons here in regards to Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans about race, fractures, fissures, the limits of American greatness that I think we can really put in dialogue with where we are now in the age of COVID and ongoing divisions and strife in America. A couple of images here before we leave Hurricane Katrina and talk one more time about immigration. On the left, here is a father holding his infant as he wades through the diseased muck. And he's looking up at a camera from a helicopter that flies over, again, seemingly indifferent and callous to the suffering of this individual. We're reading the Zaytoun book. We know about the efforts of Abdul Rahman Zaytoun to help people who were also left behind, and in the way in which he ultimately was also disciplined and punished by authorities when all he was doing was, again, trying to help people. How he was considered a potential terrorist is called Al-Qaeda, even though he was trying to help people because their own government abandoned them. On the right here is a dilapidated van, and believe it or not, someone has spray painted on this van, "Please don't loot, it's all we have left. God bless." And this was taking place again in the wealthiest nation on earth. That someone was so desperate that they would spray paint a dilapidated van, hoping to shy off looters. That's all they had in the world. This was going on in this country in the 21st century. The third event of the first decade of the 21st century that I want to reference in this lecture, as it again is a flashpoint for us to think about questions of American identity, American community, this question of who is one of us, that we are thinking about in our final weeks together, but really we've been thinking about throughout this course, is the effort by the Bush administration to pursue comprehensive immigration reform in Bush's second term. I mentioned this earlier. George W. Bush is reelected in 2004. And he hoped to accomplish in his second term comprehensive immigration reform, pass a bill that would beef up border security, establish more restrictions and efforts to police immigration to this country, but also provide a pathway to citizenship for those who are in the country illegally, do things like pass the DREAM Act, which would allow, again, legal status, not citizenship, just legal status, for children who did not willfully break the law but were in the country illegally, who came with their parents when they were very young and were graduating from college or willing to serve in the military. So the Bush administration wanted to pursue comprehensive immigration reform, and that meant 2005, 2006, in the same moment where the nation was rocked by the cataclysm of Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans. In those years, 2005, 2006, once again, the immigration debate flared in America. And it flared in 2005, 2006 in a very different context than it had previously. As we mentioned in our most recent lecture, 1965, Congress passes and President Johnson signed into law the Hart-Celler Act. And it did a number of things: open America's borders after decades of strict immigration restrictions, and it led to a large influx of people from places like Africa, Asia, Latin America. It had all the demographic effects that we have been talking about that help you understand the America you live in today, where we have a much more diverse, pluralistic America. So in 2005, the effects of the Hart-Celler Act had now been felt for decades. As early as the 1990s, as we talked about, with things like Prop 187, the LA riots, the Minutemen movement, there were already examples, 1990s, of blowback, resistance to the greater pluralism and diversity in America that came with the Hart-Celler Act. By 2005, that blowback was intensifying because the effects of this immigration reform were more and more pronounced, more and more visible. One of the effects of the Hart-Celler Act was the way in which our neighborhoods, our basic lives were transformed, and a more diverse and pluralistic America becomes increasingly visible. And in 2005, that visibility was increasing. And then President Bush attempted to pursue immigration reform that would grant legal status to, again, people who were undocumented within the country. And that effort was pursued in a context where there was a larger immigrant population in America, where parts of America that hitherto hadn't been sites of increasing immigration populations were now sites of increasing populations. In the early 21st century, immigrants weren't just coming to Los Angeles and Chicago and New York. They were heading to areas in the Midwest, in the American South. Toyota and many Japanese automakers were establishing plants in places like Alabama, Tennessee. If you drive a Toyota or Honda, you might imagine, oh, it's a Japanese car. It's probably made in Japan. No. The majority of Toyotas and Hondas, Nissans that are sold in America are made in the United States or increasingly in places like Mexico. So in the 1990s, in the early aughts, the first decade of the 21st century, there was a manufacturing boom in the American South, and it led to a large influx of immigrants who would either work in those factories or have jobs associated with the economic effects of establishing a Toyota plant somewhere in Tennessee. Also, the meatpacking industry in the Midwest attracted a lot of immigrants who would labor in those meatpacking facilities, producing the hamburger patties that we read about or learned about in our lecture on fast food. So this also has to be brought into our understanding of why immigration is such a powder keg of debate in the 21st century. It's not only because there are more immigrants and immigrants from places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, places that previously had not been sources of large-scale immigration. It's that immigrants are now living in parts of the country that had not been deeply affected by large-scale immigration previously. The South, the Midwest. As we'll talk about in a moment, the American city that today has seen the most rapid foreign-born population, it's not Los Angeles, it's not Chicago, it's not New York, it's Nashville, Tennessee. And so those parts of the country that previously had not been particularly diverse have seen a large influx of immigrants, and as a result, those parts of the country have been hotbeds of anti-immigrant sentiment. So Country Music USA, Nashville, is now the city in America with the highest rate of growth in its immigrant population, because places like Tennessee and other areas in the South have seen this shift in manufacturing, with places like Toyota and Honda establishing plants, and that's affected the population and demography of those parts of America that, again, had not seen large-scale immigration earlier. Los Angeles, we're used to a large immigrant population. Chicago, New York, urban areas. When parts of the country receive large numbers of immigrants, particularly from places like Asia, Africa, the Middle East, that had not previously seen large-scale immigration, well, you're going to get the resistance and blowback that so defines the immigration debate in America in the 21st century. And a lot of that debate, of course, centers on this idea of undocumented or illegal immigration. Now, again, in 2005, fresh off his re-election, hoping to accomplish a great deal in his second term, George W. Bush, a conservative Republican, said we need to pass comprehensive immigration reform that will do two things. He wanted to address the concerns of his fellow Republicans. So he said we're going to hire more Border Patrol agents. We're going to build more fencing and walls along, again, the southern border. There's never seemingly a concern about the northern border, even though more undocumented immigrants in America today right now have come from the Canadian border than the southern border. You would never know that, again, in the anti-immigrant rhetoric you hear. So Bush, placating, addressing the concerns of conservatives and Republicans, said, well, we're going to build more fencing and more walls in the southern border. But he also said, as a compromise to the pro-immigrant side of this debate, we're going to offer a pathway to citizenship, a pathway to legalization, not instant citizenship or instant legalization, for the millions of people who are here in the United States as undocumented immigrants, most of whom came here legally. That's an important point I made in the previous lecture, and one we need to always be mindful of. The majority of people in this country today, who we might call illegal immigrants or undocumented, came here legally. They simply overstayed their visas. Here again is this question of who is an American? Who is one of us? Does it mean you're here? You're, again, our coworkers, our neighbors, our classmates, our fellow titans, or does status merely come down to legality? Bush was saying these are people who are here. Some of them have been here their entire lives. They are part of our communities. They are our classmates, our coworkers, our bosses, our employees. They are taxpayers. They are members of the American community, and they deserve a chance to stay. In exchange for that, we will build more walls, more fencing, we'll hire more Border Patrol agents. That was the idea of comprehensive immigration reform, where both sides of the debate get something. But ultimately, Bush would fail in his efforts to pass immigration reform. He will leave office in 2009, having been unable to do so. And that's because of the intense anti-immigrant sentiment within his own party, and strong anti-immigrant sentiment in certain parts of the country who, again, were unsettled by the demographic changes we've seen with the Hart-Celler Act, with the rise of the new immigrants, with immigrants coming to the suburbs, immigrants coming to Nashville, Tennessee. And so there was great resistance to the Bush administration. In the early 21st century, when many people saw middle-class households struggling to get by, soaring housing and education costs, stagnant wages, many people blamed immigrants for that. The economic woes that plagued America, and were so visible in events like Hurricane Katrina. And that too played a role in the backlash to comprehensive immigration reform. So why does Bush fail? Even though he was a conservative Republican and was willing to again spend on more Border Patrol agents, more law enforcement efforts to clamp down on illegal immigration. Well, there was a backlash to his efforts, and it was advanced by people who were unnerved, troubled by the greater diversity, pluralism that's come to America since the Hart-Celler Act, who often blamed immigrants for the deep economic woes that plagued middle-class and working-class Americans in the 21st century, in an age of globalization, in an age of deindustrialization, in an age where it's harder and harder to climb into the middle class with soaring housing and education problems. Many people blamed immigrants for those stagnant wages. And that's why, despite the efforts of George W. Bush, immigration reform did not pass. Instead, what does pass is more punitive measures. A measure was passed by the U.S. House, which at the time in 2006 was dominated by Republicans, that would reclassify being in the country illegally, doing things like overstay a visa, to a felony when it had previously been a misdemeanor. So the only meaningful legislation that seemed to be able to get through Congress, rather than comprehensive immigration reform where both sides get something, the pro-immigrant side gets a form of a pathway to legal status or even citizenship, a DREAM Act that offered legal status, not citizenship, to people who were here, again, for decades, who were able to graduate from college and therefore would be contributory members of the American community or willing to fight in the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The anti-immigrant or the more regulatory disciplinary side of this would get more Border Patrol agents and more funding for walls and fencing along the southern border. But that doesn't happen. The only seemingly legislation that can be passed today is exclusively from that disciplinary side, as the U.S. House in 2006 passed a bill that would again make being in the country illegally a felony, ratcheting up the penalties for, again, being in the country as an undocumented immigrant. While this debate was taking place in 2005, 2006, there were massive rallies in favor of this comprehensive immigration reform, this great compromise. Pro-immigrant rallies took place around the country. The largest public demonstration in the entire history of Nashville, Tennessee, a history that goes back to the colonial period, took place in 2006 as a pro-immigrant rally. So Bush was pursuing comprehensive immigration reform. It was to him going to be his signature achievement of his second term. From this comes this debate about immigration, which is really a debate about the American community, who is one of us. The pro-immigrant side of this argument, the rallies that were taking place, said America is a country of immigrants. These are people. They are, again, taxpayers. They are our neighbors. They are our classmates. They are our students. They are our teachers. And they deserve a chance at the American dream. That's what these pro-immigrant rallies were expressing. The largest public demonstration in the history of Nashville, Tennessee, Country Music USA, was one of these pro-immigrant rallies. Some who marched and hoped that this would be a moment for legal status to no longer fear deportation were veterans of the Iraq War. Immigrants have fought in all of our wars throughout American history, from the Revolutionary War through the still ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many who serve in our military today aren't American citizens. They hope through their sacrifice and service they'll get a chance to become citizens. That's often why they're willing to fight in these wars that American citizens themselves often avoid fighting in or refuse to fight in. So if this is about who is an American, many of these immigrants said, look, I've sacrificed for this nation. I've served this nation. All I want is a chance at the American dream. So this again was the pro-immigrant side of this debate. Many church groups pledged to support people and prevent them from being deported. They were willing to engage in acts of civil disobedience to protect members of their community. Again, these are our fellow members of our communities, our neighborhoods, our worship communities, the flock of a local church. So there was a strong pro-immigrant side by both immigrants and Americans, but other people watching this on TV said, well, these people should be deported. And they often indicated that in a lot of these rallies you see the Mexican flag. As you can see in this photograph here, you see a lot of American flags, the actual American flag, and stars and stripes and patriotic messages, USA built by immigrants. That is that strong pro-immigrant sentiment in America. But you also see the Mexican flag, because it was about this idea of being proud of who you are, your heritage, that you're an American too, much like you might see an Italian American or Irish American proud of their heritage. But when people saw these images of the Mexican flag, it reinforced this belief that they're not truly Americans, that they don't want to be Americans. And again, The immigration reform that Bush attempted to pursue ultimately thwarted, never passes. Instead, the only legislation that has been passed in the last 20 years regarding immigration has been from the more punitive side, the more regulatory, the more exclusionary side. Following George W. Bush, Barack Obama, who was elected in 2008, and he too took up this mantle, took up this concern of immigration reform. He too wanted to be a president who would preside over comprehensive immigration reform, where again, both sides get something. The anti-immigrant side gets more border patrol agents, more restrictions, more fencing, whatever you want, right? But the pro-immigrant side gets a pathway to legalization. Not necessarily a pathway to citizenship, just legalization. You won't be deported. And Obama tried that for 8 years, and he failed. And then, following Obama, came a candidate who ran on an explicit anti-immigrant platform, Donald Trump. So we have seen now in the 21st century, in an America that has been transformed by the Hart-Celler Act, the new immigrants, a more diverse, pluralistic America, this powder keg of debate and an inability to reconcile these questions, an inability to pass comprehensive immigration reform where both sides get something. So reform continues to stall to get around the unwillingness of Congress to pass something like the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is a very modest step. It grants to, again, people who came here as children, not willfully breaking the law, but came with their parents, who in many cases have lived in this country for decades, who graduate from college, meaning that they sacrifice and work hard and earn that degree and are certainly going to be contributory members of American society, taxpayers for the next 40, 50 years. Or those who serve in the military. The DREAM Act would grant them legal status. Again, not citizenship, just legal status. Bush pursued it, Obama pursued it, and Congress refused to pass that action. What we did in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, seems to be an impossible dream in the 21st century. To get around that, Obama pursued through executive action just protections for DACA recipients, people who would be recognized as, again, people who didn't break the law willfully, who came as children, many of whom have been here for decades. And then there's been an effort to reverse that. So we are certainly in a continuing debate about immigration, which is really a debate about who's one of us and the American community. And in this lecture, we have mined 3 signal events: September 11th, the Patriot Act, Hurricane Katrina, and now this debate about immigration reform that really demonstrates this ongoing debate regarding who is one of us. Let's just spend a few moments here reflecting on the class as a whole, as this is our last lecture. We had 4 time periods, 4 themes. We talked about the image of the frontier in colonial America, the antebellum reform era of feminism, abolitionism, and religious reform. After the midterm, we've been focusing on the way in which consumerism comes to define the American experience in the late 19th and 20th century. And now in our last few lectures and our final book, we're thinking about what America has become since 1965 in regards to demography. And though this class, necessarily as it's designed to, covers 4 different time periods, really throughout the class, we've been talking about the same questions. Who's one of us? In the frontier period, it was this question of who's one of us, who's civilized, who's uncivilized, what defines us in contradistinction to them. But that was true in the antebellum reform period, where people imagined an end to slavery, an equality among the genders, a new America reborn, resurrected, in line with those ideals of equality and freedom. Consumerism was about imagining an American ideal, an American dream, related to stuff, abundance, consumer goods. And of course, certainly, when we've thought about the Hart-Celler Act and the events we've covered in this lecture, it's about, again, what marks those who are within and those who are forever to be outside that vision of us. Also throughout this class, we've been thinking about what we aspire to. What is the American dream? What do we seek? Whether it was the colonial period, and the ways in which Americans created a certain vision that, again, was defined in relation to Native Americans who were imagined to be outside that dream and ideal. The antebellum reform period, where people dreamed big about reform and change and imagined a remade America. The consumerist era, where the American dream in many ways was defined through consumer goods. And then, if you think about things like the Dream Act, when we think about immigration in an America of the 21st century, America that could do great things, and an America that was more inclusive, again, it's very much about these questions of ideals and dreams. So I hope everyone enjoyed the class. I hope everyone learned a great deal. And I hope certainly you enjoyed our final lecture here as we wrap up the course accordingly.